All right, guys, so we got some updates here on what I think is arguably the single greatest threat to the First Amendment and to free speech rights in this country that we have had in a very long time, as the Trump administration, in what he is calling the first of many, has arrested, disappeared, and is threatening to deport Mhamoud Khalil, a student activist at the Columbia University campus who has been leading the charge in protesting against Israel's genocide in Gaza. So we're going to go ahead and start off with this here from The Guardian in terms of hundreds of people taking to protest on Mahmoud's behalf. So they start off here with an image of what these protests look like, and the details are as follows. They say protesters organized by a progressive Jewish group occupied the lobby of Trump Tower in New York on Thursday to demand the release of Mhamoud Khalil, the Palestinian Columbia University student held by U.S. immigration authorities, and nearly 100 of them were arrested. They say that chanted slogans included "Free Mahmoud, Free Them All," and "Fight Nazis, Not Students." Other chants included "We will not comply, Mahmoud, we are on your side," and "Bring Mahmoud home." They say that many of the protesters, in a group estimated to be between 100 and 300 strong, wore red t-shirts bearing the message, quote, "Jews say stop arming Israel." And by early afternoon, footage was posted showing officers from the NYPD beginning to arrest some of these protesters. Now, you'll notice here that this protest is being led by Jewish Voices for Peace, right? A Jewish organization, which kind of throws a wrench in the narrative that the Trump administration is trying to sell. And this is the justification that they are giving for arresting, detaining, and then deporting Mhamoud Khalil, is that he has been the ringleader of an anti-Semitic, hateful, violent protest campaign at Columbia University. Now, again, kind of throws a wrench in that when you come to realize that it's Jewish organizations, it's Jewish students who have been helping to lead many of these protests. Right? And the reality is that, of course, the protests that have been taking place, not just on college campuses, but across the U.S., these protests are not about Jewish people. The protests are about the actions of the state of Israel. And those are completely different things. The Trump administration, right-wingers, and the most ardent defenders of Israel, they don't want you to view those as two separate things. But they are, in fact, two separate things. So if you're protesting the genocidal actions of the government of Israel, that's not an anti-Semitic protest. And you can see by the fact that you have hundreds of Jewish students, hundreds of Jewish protesters who are showing up on Mhamoud Khalil's behalf, that's probably not what the core of those protests were initially about. And that maybe the justification for his deportation is complete and utter bullshit and really has more to do with the Trump administration trying to silence any criticism of the government of Israel. Now, they continue here. They say, in a statement, the group said, quote, "The detention of Mahmoud is further proof that we are on the brink of a full takeover by a repressive authoritarian regime," continuing saying that as Jews of conscience, we know our history and we know where this leads. It's all on us to stand up now. Many of us are the descendants of people who resisted European fascism, and far too many of our ancestors lost their lives in that struggle. We call on the strength of our ancestors and we call on our tradition, which teaches us that we must never stand idly by. They also say that they are accusing the Trump administration of having no interest in Jewish safety and co-opting anti-Semitism, both of which are absolutely true. And they say, "I'm just standing up for my rights, and I'm standing up for Mhamoud Khalil, who has been abducted illegally and taken to an undisclosed location. Does that sound like America to you?" So in terms of where he's actually at right now, they say here that he is now in custody in Louisiana without charge, but held under a rarely used immigration law provision that allows the Secretary of State, in this circumstance Marco Rubio, to approve the detention of anyone deemed to be a threat to U.S. foreign policy. So do you understand this, guys? This is what the Trump White House spokesperson, Caroline Leavitt, or whatever her name is, confirmed just a couple of days ago. And Sagar asked this question directly, and she confirmed that this has nothing to do with Mhamoud Khalil committing any sort of crime whatsoever. That's not what this is about. She openly said that he is being arrested, disappeared, and deported because his actions in protesting a foreign government, in this case Israel, that conflicts with the foreign policy goals of the Trump administration. So in other words, not committing any crime, he wasn't charged with anything, but he is being thrown out of the country because he dared to disagree with U.S. foreign policy. Like, if that is not a direct authoritarian threat to the concept of free speech, then one doesn't exist, right? Now they continue. They say his lawyer, Bahir Azmi, the director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, said that his arrest is absolutely unprecedented and essentially a form of retaliation and punishment for the exercise of free speech. And that's exactly what it is. And they're admitting that. They say amid the Trump administration attacks on universities or pro-Palestine protests, observers say that Khalil is being used as a test case for mass arrests. And again, they are openly saying this. Trump is saying this is the first of many to come. They say that Trump has said that Khalil's arrest is the first of many to come, and promised to deport students seen to be guilty of pro-terrorist, anti-Semitic, anti-American activity. And I just want to highlight this last part because this sort of gives away the game, right? Because it's one thing if you're out there actually engaging in like pro-terrorism, sort of like a conspiracy, and you're calling on innocent civilians to be massacred or something. Of course, that doesn't apply to Mhamoud Khalil, but you'll notice that Trump included not just pro-terrorist, by which he means criticizing Israel, or anti-Semitic, by which again he means criticizing Israel, but he also included anti-American activity. So it is the official position of the Trump administration that you should be deported from the country for doing anything that he subjectively views as anti-American. I mean, this is full-blown like throwback to the Cold War McCarthyite bullshit that we're talking about right here. Okay, this is like Red Scare 2.0, but specifically about criticizing Israel that we're talking about here. And again, they point out, this is just a test case. This is just the first of many to come. Now, we continue with a video here of Mhamoud Khalil's lawyer, who is speaking outside of one of these courthouses here, I believe. So let's go ahead and watch this video, and then I have another one right after.
Arrested and detained to basically put the university on notice that he was feeling unprotected by the university, and that he was worried about detention by ICE and doxing and actions by private actors. He was in fear for his life and well-being. That is accurate. He did send that email to the head of Columbia University, and I think his email raises an important question. This is a university that has spent the better part of the last year talking about its duty to protect students and to keep them safe. But in a scenario where numerous students are being approached by ICE on Columbia's campus, and one Columbia student, Mhamoud Khalil, has been effectively disappeared by U.S. government agents, again, on Columbia's property, the university has been remarkably absent and silent.
So there he is talking about the complicity of the University of Columbia, or Columbia University, as there was reporting that Mahmoud had actually reached out to the university to say, I'm fearful that potentially the government is going to come after me, right? And Columbia has handled this in an absolutely abysmal way, not just in specific relation to Mhamoud Khalil, but also before that as well. I mean, this is the same university that, sucked the NYPD on peaceful encampment protesters and people who were trying to occupy buildings. And, keep in mind, like, there's the right-wing spin on this, that these people are all violent, they're all anti-Semitic, they're all pro-terrorism or whatever, but like, the goal of these protesters is entirely reasonable, okay? The goal of the protests at Columbia University was to get the university to divest from Israel, right? As a form of boycott, as a form of protest against an ongoing genocide, an ongoing apartheid, and an ongoing ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. Like in a normal, objective world where we gave a shit about human beings, this would not be controversial. Okay, it shouldn't be controversial, but it is because we live in the United States of America, and that's one of our top geopolitical allies, and we, like to have them as our best friends, and so we couldn't possibly offend them, and they have tremendous influence in U.S. politics, and so it's an entirely different conversation here in the U.S., but objectively, this should not be a controversial demand that they were making in the first place. But instead, he's being made out to be some sort of like a radical terrorist or something like that. It's just completely ludicrous. Now, second follow-up statement, again here by Mahmoud's lawyer.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As we tried to make clear in court today, what happened to Mhamoud Khalil is nothing short of extraordinary and shocking and outrageous. It should outrage anybody who believes that speech should be free in the United States of America. Mr. Khalil is a lawful permanent resident. He was coming home with his U.S. citizen wife, who was 8 months pregnant, and he was taken by U.S. government agents in retaliation, essentially, for exercising his First Amendment rights, for speaking up in defense of Palestinians in Gaza and beyond, for being critical of the U.S. government and of the Israeli government. Those are the reasons why he was targeted. Those are the reasons why he was detained. And that's the reason why the government also moved him to Louisiana in further retaliation for the fact that on the night of his arrest at home, he filed a habeas corpus petition in this court, which he also had a constitutional right to do. In retaliation for that, he was moved to Louisiana to take him away from his lawyers, to take him away from accessing this court, to take him away from his family and his support network. And so every day that Mahmoud spends in detention in Louisiana is a day too long. We and he fully intend to vindicate not just his First Amendment rights, but those of all Americans, frankly, and all lawful permanent residents, and anybody who wants to speak out. It simply cannot be the case that you can be disappeared at night off the streets of New York City simply because the current U.S. government, the current administration.
So, listen, guys, for conservatives out there who think, oh, well, just get him out of here. Who cares about this guy? He's pro-Hamas or whatever. Like, I need you guys to think about the precedent that this is setting. Okay, imagine that we're under an ultra-liberal or a leftist presidential administration. The standard that you are setting up here is that that president could say, well, I think that climate change, for example, is a national security issue. And so any right-wingers who protest against my climate policy, I am going to deem to be a national security threat. And if you happen to be on a student visa or you happen to be a green card holder, you're out, you're gone. You could also make the same case and say, well, I think that MAGA or I think that Trump supporters or Republicans are racist, right? And so I think that racism is part of our foreign policy agenda in terms of fighting against it. And so I am going to deport anybody who I possibly can, who I view to be in line with right-wing racist values, as subjective as that claim may be. Right? Think about if this was in the reverse, how absolutely up in arms, hysterical the right would be about this kind of a situation. But it's specifically because it's Mhamoud Khalil, because it's, a Palestinian protester, that they're just like, oh, okay, this doesn't really matter, right? I need you guys to just slow down for a second. My conservative free speech, self-proclaimed warriors, okay? And think about the precedent that this is setting. It's absolutely insane. Now, again, also important to point out that as a green card holder, right, and this is some confusion that I've seen from the right online, you have First Amendment free speech protections, okay? Just because you weren't born in the United States or just because you're not a full American citizen, that doesn't mean that the Constitution no longer exists. It absolutely does, okay? So Mhamoud Khalil faces the same protections as anybody else does, essentially, in terms of free speech and the First Amendment right to protest and to disagree with the actions of the U.S. government. Now, whether or not legally the Trump administration can get away with deporting people like Mhamoud Khalil, that may end up happening, right? They may end up getting away with this in the short term. But again, let's slow down. Let's think about the implications of what this actually means. This is as draconian, as anti-free speech as it possibly gets. And again, they're openly admitting this. They're not saying he committed some violent crime. Okay, so we have to charge him and arrest him and put him in jail or deport him for that reason. No, they're saying he disagreed with our foreign policy goals, in this case, supporting a genocide, and so therefore he's being deported. That's the legal case that they are making against Khalil. So let's just keep that in mind, exactly what we're talking about here. Now, we move on because we also have some unhinged mainstream media segments with right-wingers, conservatives, saying the quiet part out loud and backing up the deportation of Mahmoud. Let's go ahead and start off here. I'll put this at 1.25 times speed with a CNN panel with Scott Jennings, just absolutely talking out of his ass here.
He's a resident alien. He can be deported under U.S. law for if the Secretary of State has any reasonable ground to believe he would have a potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequence. And you mentioned the student organization. The student organization put out... Let me finish.
But before you move on, because I think that's a really important point, right? That's the statute that they're using.
Yeah.
Have you seen any evidence to suggest that there is actually a serious reason to believe that this student is going to be a threat to national security?
Man, I've certainly watched the abomination that's gone on at Columbia and Barnard and other places, and I'll just tell you...
To national security.
And I'll just tell you that
I'm not going to let you move on because this is...
I'll tell you why it's a threat to national security if you let me answer you.
Well, Scott.
Do you want me to answer you or not?
Okay.
His organization says we are dedicated fighting for the total eradication of Western civilization.
Okay.
He's not a citizen. He doesn't need to be here.
You just described him having viewpoints that you disagree with. Again, is that enough to have someone lose their rights in this country?
He has viewpoints that, in my opinion, jeopardize the security of the United States.
But how?
He is obviously a radical who is here to foment.
No, he's not radical at all.
He's against the United States government.
He wants to destroy Western civilization.
Yeah, okay. So he's not a radical. Okay, let's keep that in mind. I'm going to finish off this video towards the very end, if you guys wait for it, with his viewpoint in his own words. So we're going to watch that and get a clearer picture of it. But he's not a radical by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, his position is essentially that the genocide in Gaza needs to stop. The illegal occupation and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians has to stop, and that Jews and Palestinians should have to come together in order to form some sort of a long-lasting peace, right? Like a very baseline, standard position. Okay, this guy isn't calling for violence in the streets or anything like that. It's just completely contrived, completely made up bullshit here from Scott Jennings. Now, specifically on his claim that Mhamoud Khalil and his organization have called for the downfall of Western civilization. Follow up on that here from Dropsite News, because they actually dug into this. They say, according to Fox News and much of the rest of the media, Mhamoud Khalil has called for the total eradication of Western civilization. They say here, and this is important, guys, even if the allegation were true, which it's not, it would be protected speech, right? So this shouldn't even matter in the first place, but it's not. The phrase appeared on an Instagram post linked to an organization that Khalil has been affiliated with. However, Dropsite News can report, based on conversations with a source with knowledge of the situation, that Khalil was not involved with any of CUAD's Instagram posts. He may not even have seen this post, and he may not be aware that the phrase is being used as a part of the Kafkaesque effort to deport him as a national security threat. I mean, guys, the notion that this guy is a threat to the national security of the United States of America is a fucking joke. It's a joke. He is a college student, okay? He's been leading protests at this college to try to get them to divest amidst a fucking genocide. Like, can we just put things into perspective here? We're talking about tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people that have either been killed or horrifically maimed or displaced or starved with U.S. backing. And our priority is to say that this college student protesting that and U.S. complicity in that is the threat. That guy's the threat, really. I mean, again, it's just a fucking joke. And again, in terms of, he called for the downfall of Western civilization, we're literally talking about an Instagram post from an organization that he is tangentially associated with. So that's the justification we're giving now. We're saying we can deport people under the justification that you have a tangential association with an organization that once posted this phrase on Instagram. That makes you a national security threat, apparently now, according to conservatives. And again, this is supposedly the free speech party that we're discussing here. Now, we move on to the next clip, also I believe on the same show, and this one's even more amazing because this right-wing guy claims that Mhamoud Khalil is being paid by some foreign terrorist organization. He's asked to provide receipts on that claim and comes up with absolute nothing.
I think the question here is about whether speech can result in people's legal rights being taken away.
He's a virulent anti-Semite. He came here on a student visa. He's paid by a terrorist organization that beheads babies.
What evidence do you have of
beheads babies?
Wait.
I have evidence.
So I'm sorry, just to be clear, you're alleging that he's paid by
He's a paid protester.
By who?
Well, I didn't ask my intelligence division exactly who paid for him, but he's being paid by. He's being paid.
That's a pretty explosive allegation. Who is he being paid by?
Can I ask you a question?
No, you said you had
really
evidence. Who is he being paid by?
He's being paid by organizations that are anti-American, that are engaged in nefarious activities. I don't ask my intelligence division to give me.
Then don't come on national TV and say on things. Don't come on national TV.
Do you know who he's being paid by?
I don't, and I'm not alleging that he's being paid.
Are you okay with what he's doing?
I'm not alleging he's being paid by because I don't know.
Are you okay with anti-Semitism?
You are coming.
Okay, so he moves on to just completely change the topic and say, again, he's been leading these anti-Semitic protests or whatever. He just made this allegation on live TV, right, in front of the entire country, that Mhamoud Khalil is being paid by a foreign terrorist organization. He's asked, can you give me some clarification on that? What terrorist organization are you talking about here? Can you be specific? And he doesn't even say specifically Hamas, which is what you would think he would say. in a continuation of this bullshit diatribe that he's going on here, he just says, like, humiliatingly, I didn't ask. Okay, so you know for a fact, apparently, that he's being paid by a terrorist organization to do what he's doing right now. But you can't say who, because you didn't bother to ask your intelligence people who are the people paying him? Really? Seems like that might be like the first question that I would ask if I was given that information. Now, of course, he doesn't have that information because it's bullshit, because he just completely made it up to further his own narrative, right? I mean, that's very clear, because if you had that information, you would expose it. And if there was information that Mhamoud Khalil was some raging anti-Semite who wants to terrorize Western civilization, it would have come out by now, right? It's just that that's not the truth, right? And keep in mind, like, as they pointed out before, this is a guy on a green card, okay? He is a lawful permanent resident. The First Amendment is supposed to be applying to him. He has an 8 months pregnant American citizen wife who is here with him. And he's being deported for, again, what exactly? For anti-American activities? This is where we're at now, guys. Now, we continue. We got another one. Here we have Tommy Tuberville, senator from Alabama, who just says the quiet part out loud on this and takes it to an entirely different level, saying protesters should all be jailed. Just jail all of the protesters. Let's go ahead and watch this.
Of education. We have K through 12 and we have higher ed. We've got to treat both of them different. But when it comes to protesters, we got to make sure we treat all of them the same. Send them to jail. Free speech is great, but hate, free speech is not what we need in these universities, and they don't need to be doing things that they're preaching from Hamas about anti-Semitism.
Anti-Semitism. Okay, so first off, this guy probably has the IQ of a potato, so I don't know why I would listen to anything that he has to say, but he's saying the quiet part out loud here, guys. I mean, this is a senator. This is one of the 100 most powerful and influential people in the country. This guy helps to write our laws, right? Let's think about that for a second. And he's saying, arrest, jail all of the protesters. Not protesters who commit violent crimes or like property destruction or anything like that. He's saying just arrest all of the protesters. And of course, he doesn't mean all of the protesters, right? January 6 people, they get a pardon, but he means specifically the pro-Palestine protesters. Just arrest and jail them all. That's his solution to what's going on now. We also have this here from Tom Homan, Trump's border czar, who says something similar here in terms of free speech rights, which apparently don't apply to criticizing the government of Israel.
Free speech has limitations, but when you go to a college campus, you incite protesting and locking down, taking over buildings and damaging property and handing out leaflets for Hamas, who is a terrorist organization. Coming to this country either on a visa or becoming a resident alien is a great privilege, but there are rules associated with that.
So there are limitations on free speech rights, apparently. Now, listen, of course there are, constitutionally. Like, you can't go into a crowded theater and yell fire and cause a panic, or you can't directly threaten violence on another person. There are restrictions to free speech, none of which has Mhamoud Khalil violated, right? So we're just fabricating things here to justify the idea that he has stepped over some imaginary boundary in terms of free speech rights that doesn't actually exist, that they're actively making up in real time. And I mean, with Tommy Tuberville, he cites like hate speech here, which is something that I thought conservatives were vehemently against prosecuting, right? Because these are many of the same conservatives who they want white nationalists to be able to be proud and to go out and to protest in public spaces. And, you know, they shouldn't be facing any legal consequences, even if they're full-blown neo-Nazis or whatever, right? Or even if they're openly racist or transphobic or whatever the case may be. They don't think that those people should be prosecuted or arrested or jailed for their speech. It's just in this one specific instance that they start using this verbiage of hate speech and start saying, well, we shouldn't let people say anything, right? If you're criticizing Israel, then maybe that shouldn't count under the bounds of free speech. Now, in terms of how Democrats have been handling this, we have here from Chuck Schumer. And this kind of puts into perspective how pathetic and double-sided the Democratic Party has been under the second term of the Trump administration. Here, Chuck Schumer says, I abhor many of the opinions and policies that Mhamoud Khalil holds and supports, and have made my criticism of the anti-Semitic actions at Columbia loudly known. Mr. Khalil is also a legal permanent resident here, and his wife, who is 8 months pregnant, is an American citizen. While he may well be in violation of various campus rules regarding how protests were conducted over the last year, that is a matter for the university to pursue, and I have encouraged them to be much more robust in how they combat anti-Semitism and maintain a harassment-free campus that protects the safety and security of Jewish students. He says, the Trump administration, DHS, must articulate any criminal charges or facts that would justify his detention or the initiation of deportation proceedings against him. If the administration cannot prove he has violated any criminal law to justify taking a severe action and is doing it for the opinions he has expressed, then that is wrong, and they are violating the First Amendment protections. Now, guys, I mean, look at this. Look at how fucking pathetic this is. This is supposedly the leader of the resistance for Senate Democrats. And like the first 2 paragraphs of this are him saying, basically justifying the right-wing narrative about Mhamoud Khalil. That is completely wrong. That is completely false. He's disingenuously smearing the protests at Columbia University. I mean, these are the same protests where they've been holding like Seder meals on a weekly basis at some of these encampments. And he's saying, well, sure, the protests are anti-Semitic, right? And Columbia should crack down hard on them. And Mhamoud Khalil is kind of a monster, and I disagree with everything that he believes and supports. But on a technicality, if the Trump administration can't prove that he did anything technically criminal, then maybe this is a bad thing. It's like, it could not be more pathetic. You're basically saying nothing here. This is the resistance. Now, keep in mind, these are some of the same people, like Chuck Schumer, some of these top Democrats who run campaigns on the idea that Trump is an authoritarian threat to the country. Here's your authoritarian threat. It's happening right here in front of you for the entire world to see. This is it. This is a standard of how are we going to approach the First Amendment and free speech moving forward. This is a test case scenario. And this is your response to it. This is your resistance to fascism in this country, is to basically give way to the right-wing narrative on this entire situation. But then to say, yeah, but maybe it's not such a good idea. Maybe it's not such a good thing. I mean, come on, man. Now, I'll leave you guys off with that. We're going to finish with this video of Mhamoud Khalil's story in his own words, as posted here by Breakthrough News. My last thoughts, and I'll finish this off. I won't even say anything after the video. But guys, I mean, this is the moment. Like, this is anybody who you felt was potentially hyperbolic in criticizing Trump for being a fascist, for being an authoritarian, for being a threat to fundamental rights in this country. Like, this is the moment where it smacks you in the face. Okay, we have the Trump administration threatening to mass arrest, disappear, and deport people for speech that he disagrees with, for speech that is critical of U.S. foreign policy. Okay, this is not a joke. This is not a test case scenario. This is real shit. And if they can do this to Mhamoud Khalil, then they can do it to other people on student visas, other people on green cards, and also to American citizens. This is the first step of many in a dark line that we are walking right now. So take this shit seriously. Now, we're going to go ahead and finish off here again with Mhamoud Khalil in his own story.
I was born and raised in a Palestinian refugee camp in southern Damascus in Syria. My family's history in Palestine actually goes back to as long as my grandparent could trace it. They lived in a very small village right next to Tiberias. Mostly they were farmers. My grandmother, she used to tell us that she had Jewish neighbors. They would share a piece of land where they would farm it. Tiberias was one of the first cities that the Zionists targeted in 1948 with ethnic cleansing. In April 1948, a month before the Nakba, the Zionist militias, they burned one of their villages. When they heard the news about it, they had to leave immediately. Some of the men went to fight. Big families, they had to go to Syria. My grandmother, she was pregnant at that time. She had to walk 40 miles. She gave birth on the way. When they arrived in the refugee camp, they thought it's just a matter of days until they would go back. They did not want to be killed because they heard about the horror stories across Tiberias. My dad was born in a tent. His family lived in that tent until like mid-70s when they upgraded to small structures. In the 90s, they finally kind of like had concrete buildings. It was always a temporary home until we go back to Palestine.
Politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying